Chapter 4, Section 5 is called The Great Awakening. We're going to talk about this time of religious revival in the colonial period. So our focus question is, how did the Great Awakening challenge the religious and social structure of British North America? I will give you a review of the sections with the main points, and then go back and tell you specifically what you need to know for your test. So you do need to know one thing about the introduction in the Great Awakening, and that is the last sentence that says, "Yet many church leaders worried about the lax religious observations as colonial economic growth led people to be more and more preoccupied with worldly affairs." What does that mean? That means as the colonies prospered and the economy began to do much better and life began to really settle down in the colonies, people pulled away from religion because religion didn't seem as important. Surviving, getting the economy going, protection from Native Americans, protection from the French, the Spanish, all these other things kind of took precedence and became more important than religion. And church leaders in the colonies were aware of this, and so they became very concerned with that, because religion had been central to 18th century colonial American life, and so things were changing. So let's look at that first section, religious revivals. Bibles and other religious publications were the largest category of printed materials, and religious disputes often garnered more attention than political issues in the colonies. By the 1720s and 30s, however, many ministers feared that westward expansion, a lack of individual engagement in church activities, and the growth of commerce and Enlightenment rationalism threatened religious devotion. These fears helped inspire a series of revivals across the colonies, later known as the Great Awakening, that were less a coordinated movement than local events dedicated to an emotional and personal experience of Christianity. Ministers such as Massachusetts Congregationalist Jonathan Edwards pioneered an emotional form of preaching, portraying man in his sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God, as a sinner on the verge of being condemned to damnation at any moment. Only by experiencing a new birth could one be saved. So again, to review, people were pulling away from religion. Religious leaders became very nervous of this, so they tried to bring people back. So there was these revivals and sermons. The way that preachers communicated with people changed, and it was a little bit of this, what we call hellfire and brimstone, telling people about all the bad things that will happen to them if they don't turn back to God, to faith, to Christianity. And the most famous of these preachers was Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." So what do you need to know for your test? You need to know part of that very first sentence of the first paragraph that talked about how church services were undermining religious devotion. So there really is kind of two levels to faith, to religion. There's the faith that you have, and then there's the religious devotion, what you do in church. The two may not necessarily be connected. There are plenty of people who have faith, believe in God, have spirituality, but don't necessarily go to church or go to Mass to go through the rituals. So it's not like people didn't believe in God anymore during the colonies. They certainly did believe in God, but they weren't going to church as much. And so they wanted to physically bring people back to church. So again, church services were undermining religious devotion. Look at the first sentence of the second paragraph, that the 18th century witnessed a revival of religious fundamentalism in many parts of the world. So the Great Awakening didn't happen just in the colonies. It kind of happened worldwide, and not just with the Christians. There were a lot of religions that were kind of reacting to this enlightenment of faith, because many believe that science and faith contradict each other. And so people wanted to come, religious leaders wanted people to come back to the faith. It happened in the Jewish faith, in the Muslim faith, in Islam, and certainly in Christianity. So this was kind of a worldwide revival of fundamentalism. Fundamental means going back to the basics. For Christians, that means going back to the Bible, literally believing what the Bible says is true. Moving on to the next section called the preaching of Whitefield. The preaching of Whitefield. Particularly important to spreading the revivals was English minister George Whitefield, who spread the Great Awakening through the colonies during a 2-year tour of America starting in 1739. So he's very prominent in spreading this revival feeling. Newspapers promoted his tour, including Benjamin Franklin, and tens of thousands flocked to hear him in what was the first major intercolonial event in North American history. Many members of the established churches criticized the revivalists for their lack of theological training, emotionalism, and the disorder they caused. So these revivalists could be anyone, not necessarily a priest or a preacher. Anyone who felt they had been moved by the Spirit could go out and preach, and that made those who had formal training a little bit nervous. So what do you need to know about this section for your test? Look at the first 2 sentences of the first paragraph called The Preaching of Whitefield. Religious emotionalism was not confined to the American colonies. It spread through much of 18th century Europe as well. So again, it was a worldwide phenomenon. And more than any other individual, the English minister George Whitefield declared his whole world a parish, and he is the one who sparked this great awakening. So make sure you know that. You need to know in the second paragraph, in the short middle paragraph, that Benjamin Franklin, even though he was a deist, he didn't necessarily believe in what George Whitefield was preaching. He did help publicize his tour across the colonies, publishing his sermons and his journals. So Whitefield owed a lot of his popularity to Benjamin Franklin. Those are the 2 things you need to know on this section that may be on your test. And the last section for section 5 is called the Awakening's Impact. What was the impact overall of the Great Awakening? But the Great Awakening transformed the religious life of America, splitting the old churches and creating new churches, new religious, new faiths like the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians. The awakening was to a great extent supported by the poor and the disenfranchised, and it caused some to question other authorities and institutions in colonial America. So new faiths were born. Many of the poor were drawn to this revivalist movement, and it kind of, in a way, was a way to rebel against authority and against established churches. So what do you need to know about this section for your test? So in the first paragraph, towards the end, it talks about specifically about New England. And it says here, in New England, they condemned merchants who ensnared the unwary in debt as greedy and unchristian. So in these preachers, as they went out to preach, I just mentioned how they appealed to the poor. They appealed to the poor because these preachers were preaching against commercial society, against merchants who were being greedy. And by being greedy, they were being unchristian. And when you're poor and you hear the preacher scolding the rich, you know that this preacher is speaking for you. So we talked about again how these preachers spoke especially to the poor, and that was because these preachers, especially in New England, where you had lots of merchants, they were preaching against commercial society. Lastly, you need to know in the very last paragraph of this section, the very first sentence, the revivals broadened the range of religious alternatives available to Americans. In other words, there were new faiths that were born. Now they had more variety to choose from. But by dividing churches, it also divided people, leaving a more divided than before society, at the same time more fully integrated into transatlantic religious development. So amongst the colonies, there's a little bit of divisions as religions split. You will have a split even between the Baptists, between Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists. So there is a split within the colonies, but this religious revival also helps bring them closer across to England, to other groups of people. So it's splitting from one group but connecting them to another. So that was section 5, a very short section for chapter 4. If you have any questions on this section, please let me know.